Hello, this is Russell Moore, and this is the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter, which you can get in your inbox every Wednesday for free by signing up in the link in the show notes. This week, I want to talk about the bankruptcy of the Hooters restaurant chain. Now, those of us who are traditionalist Christians have for a long time said Hooters is morally bankrupt, but the time has come for it to be actually bankrupt, financially bankrupt too. But before we sort of family values types take a victory lap, we ought to recognize that this chain, which is known for scantily clad female servers and a kind of wink and nod to male sexual appetites, the reason it's in trouble is not because it's too edgy, but because it's not edgy enough. And that ought to tell us something about the future of American culture and about the future of the church. On the one hand, a business chain of any sort filing for bankruptcy shouldn't be all that surprising to us. The post COVID years have transformed entire industries, and lots of them have suffered. The restaurant industry, in particularly, seen a lot of chains. Red Lobster, for instance, facing uncertain futures. And beyond that, no business lasts forever. Each has a life cycle of rise and fall, just as people do. And yet, as a recent analysis by journalist Annie Joy Williams of The Atlantic shows, Hooters is losing ground for being too tame for an American digital culture acclimated to internet pornography and OnlyFans. Williams points to the Hooters restaurant in her hometown of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just right down the road from me, as an example of the chain's typical business model, which is, in her words, quote, to sell just enough sex to be palatable to people like my Southern Baptist neighbors, end quote. Williams writes, quote, there weren't any strip clubs in my town. There was just Hooters, and men could always say that they went there for the wings, end quote. Now, this psychological dynamic reminds me of the preacher I knew many years ago who would preach sermons railing against the use of intoxicating beverages and the kind of people who went to bars with all the fervor of prohibitionist Carrie Nation. He could make an exception, though, for medical purposes of rye whiskey as a cough suppressant, and he seemed to be wrestling with a persistent cough for decades. But he could tell himself that he wasn't like those that he saw as degenerates who would outright ask for a beer on a bar stool. His psyche could sleep easily, really easily, turns out, knowing that he could get just as buzzed, but as a patient, not as a sinner. Now, from the sexual revolution to the digital revolution, most men who wish to sexually objectify women beyond what they could see in the course of so-called respectable society would have to go to a strip club or to a roadside sex shop or to purchase pornographic material from behind the counter in a convenience store. To do that, though, required crossing a psychological threshold, which is to admit to themselves that they were intentionally going out looking for something their conscience would tell them was wrong. Hugh Hefner counted on a certain kind of respectable man telling himself and his friends that he read Playboy for the magazine's cultured profiles of John Updike or Andy Warhol. And the guys at Hooters could claim that the club sandwiches, that was the draw. And what could he do about how the servers were dressed? Maybe this same man would be the one complaining at the deacons meeting at his church about how immodestly women were dressing these days. The internet, though, gave that man a way to pursue his illicit sexual fantasies without ever leaving the house. And it could do so in an algorithmic way that could feel like it wasn't an intentional act at all, that it was more like something happened to him than like he chose to do anything. At the same time, the sexual revolution changed sides without anyone really even noticing. The cultural left is still more likely to argue for government-funded contraception or legal abortion or the malleability of gender. But the newer sexual battles on Me Too and sexual trafficking and the ethics of consent, the left is often viewed by American sexually hedonistic culture not as hippies, but as Puritans. The new right, on the other hand, invites porn stars to speak at political conventions and celebrates the pornographer and alleged sex trafficker Tate brothers. The Amherst Faculty Lounge is more likely to talk about ethical polyamory than a conservative coded place would. But even then, it seems less transgressive to most regular people than it seems preachy and moralistic. Elon Musk, on the other hand, openly says he doesn't know whether he's the father of the child that yet another woman to whom he is not married claims to be his. And this is met by the public with yawns. In this kind of environment, Hooters can hardly build a business model off of being just naughty enough. Instead, for many people in American life, it seems as quaint as the long ago shock of American television audiences at Elvis Presley's gyrations or the Beatles' long hair. As one so called adult performer told Williams, Hooters is, quote, just too tame for today's customer, end quote. If Hooters is indeed not long for this world, we should be glad. Williams quotes the manager of a strip club asking, what's the difference between a Hooters waitress and a stripper? His chilling answer, noting what the desperation for food and shelter can do to one's options, about 6 weeks. These restaurant chains were always about exploiting economically vulnerable women, counting on the abundance of men ready to put out of their minds that these were human beings made in the image of God instead of meat for inspection and consumption. But we should take no solace in the fact that these places are not evaporating because of a superior view of marriage and family and sexuality. That didn't win the argument. In many ways, Hooters is gone because our argument was so decisively lost. The nightclub down the road from you might be empty because the people who once went there now prefer to get drunk at home, binging Netflix alone. The teenager next door to you might not be having premarital sex, but it's more likely that he's never around people in real life than it is that he's crucified his lust with the gospel. That ought to remind us of what Jesus and his apostles have already taught us. Fallen, broken, human nature might manifest itself in different ways. But between Eden and Armageddon, it's the same old fallenness and brokenness with the same old answer to it all. Culture war coding can remix occasionally who takes what side of arguing about sexual restraint versus sexual license, but it can't create fidelity. The gospel can, but that's much harder than just choosing up a side and choosing up a tribe. Hooters can also remind us that the battle to appeal to what the Bible calls the flesh is always, in the long run, a loser, even on its own terms. The appetite that can call the shots is not always sexual. Sometimes it's just as carnal appetites for wrath or revenge or cruelty or envy. Some Christian would-be influencers argue that to keep up with young men, the church should be just as edgy with an everything but explicit white ethno-nationalism. Even if this were not immoral on its own terms, and it is, it's as self-defeating as the parent who thinks giving a child a little bit of cocaine every night will keep him from trying heroin. The edginess of a shock culture Christianity will ultimately be greeted with, bless your heart, dismissal of those who've gone one step further out of the Overton window. If you appeal to, aren't we naughty, sense of transgression, you have to keep upping the dosage. If you live by carnality, you will die by carnality. The Hooters parking lot down the road from you might be emptier than it used to be. But what if your church were a place that offered something really strange in an era of rule by appetite? What if your church offered a place where men and women learn to serve and love each other, not to use each other? What if instead of asking our young men to choose which appetites will govern them, sex or rage or ambition, we modeled for them what it would look like instead to put to death the passions that seek to enslave us? Any of them, all of them. What if we offered the young women who were told that their worth is measured in their sexual attractiveness and sexual availability a very different picture? That they are joint heirs in Christ, loved and valued for who they are, not for how they can be used. Exchanging one form of exploitation for another does not a counter-revolution make. A church that offers the quiet power of the ordinary means of grace, of the ancient call to fidelity, can. This is Russell Moore, and this is the audio version of the More to the Point newsletter. Sign up in the link in the show notes to get it for free every week in your inbox on Wednesdays, and we will see you next time.